Hey everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and welcome back to this week's lesson video. And today we're doing a perspectives video and tackling a topic that I think is quite important, and I really wanted to talk about interpretation. For those who aren't familiar with my perspectives videos, they're generally videos where I just kind of freely explore an idea, give my thoughts on something, and just kind of invite a bit of a conversation on the topic given at hand. So this came about just because, I've been working on a couple of new tunes, which should be coming up fairly soon, so please do keep your ears open for that. I'll be making more announcements once things are finalized and a little more concrete. But also drawing on experience from the past year, almost 2 years at this point, working in situations where I've been asked to think about my interpretation a lot more, or where the situation has called for me to do so. And also the general situations I get called for. So without further ado, let's just get straight into the topic at hand. And when it comes to interpretation, I think this is something that we as jazz musicians, and to a greater extent maybe just improvising musicians, or in some genres even musicians period, can kind of take for granted. Often we get so caught up in how do we play something, how do we execute the idea, what is the idea, what are we trying to play, what's the sound that we're trying to convey, that we forget to actually think of why we make certain creative decisions, why we play in certain ways, how to approach certain musical situations. And this doesn't just apply to guitar players, it applies to, frankly, any musician. And I'm also making this video for band leaders, just to kind of get band leaders thinking a little more about what they want. So I'm trying to think in how I can structure this, and maybe just kind of points that I can think of in mind. I have at least a couple. And one of which is consider your approach. Consider what the situation calls for, in the sense that, is this a free floating situation where you can just kind of go in and play the tune down, which is what most of us jazz musicians are wont to do? Or does the musical environment require a little more finesse, a little more care, a little more consideration for where you're going? As I said, jazz musicians, and by a greater extent, improvising musicians, are kind of prone to treating a lot of situations as just a situation of play, which is fantastic. That lends itself to a particular aesthetic. But sometimes when that approach gets transplanted to something that maybe needs a little more care, it can kind of affect the impact of how you play, how you record. Especially because I've been doing a lot of distance recording lately, or trying to get different musicians to play on stuff. That's something I have to be extra mindful of as a band leader, and I have to be very clear in my communication of the idea, especially because it's not easy music. Maybe for a standard that would be a great approach, because a standard is dependent on everyone knowing the tune and kind of interacting around that tune. And there are very few set pieces, so to speak. The main set piece is the melody and the form, and after that you're kind of playing around it. But when this comes to something like, I don't know, an original composition, which is where I tend to live in most of the time, either my own original compositions or the original music of others, I have to be very careful. And these are points to carefully consider. Consider what your scenario is, and then craft your approach around that. Now, this brings me to actually my next point. Consider what is the driving force of the music. I think maybe sometimes we don't give that enough credit. No matter what musician, or what instrument we play, rather, we all fall back on our tendencies. And some instrument, and this kind of bleeds into another point of stop thinking like your instrument. Or think of the role of your instrument, but don't fall into the tropes of that. For example, guitar players sometimes have a tendency to ramble on, or can sometimes, if they're not careful, they cannot consider the part, or if there is a part. Or there's the common guitar player trope of being too loud. Or in some cases, the opposite, too quiet, not managing volume enough. So knowing how to fit into this. But we're talking about, those are kind of technical details. Let's talk about interpretation. Maybe we go a little off base. The same can be said for bass players, drummers, piano players, any instrumentalist has their stereotype, if you would, where we tend to go down that path, or we tend to only kind of view things from a certain lens because we live in that world. So this is why I say consider the music you're playing. Is it melody, harmony, or consider, what is the primary driver? Is it melody driven, harmony driven, or rhythmically driven? Usually it'll fall under one of those three, or a combination of at least two. It's rare to find something that really combines all three in a very smooth integration, I would say. Obviously now, if something's melodically and harmonically driven, that's not to say it isn't rhythmically driven, but maybe it takes a back seat compared to the other two. You're not worried about the intricacies of rhythm. But for example, this really becomes a defining point of how to manage a composition or an interpretation. If a piece is melody driven, for example, the prime focus is that melody. Now, to use an example, most of the music I write is very melody driven, and that comes from writing and playing, but also singing all the melodies I write as I play. So that affects the interpretation of the overall composition. What does this mean? It means that because everything is based around the melody, sometimes certain things don't follow the general expectation. For example, a recent tune I'm working on, one of the ones that will be coming up, not to get too much into kind of like the technicalities of it, because that's not really how I think about writing. The A section is two 7-bar phrases. The B section, I believe, if I remember, is a bar of 5, not a bar of 5. 5 measures, then 3, then 4 measures at the end. So it's a very odd form. And to kind of explain that, it kind of makes people go, that sounds very odd. It doesn't sound like it should fit together. But then when people listen to it, or people listen to some of the other tunes that I've written, or similar style music, I think Maria Schneider is another one that kind of writes in a very melodically driven style, Matheny too, where not everything follows a set 4, 8, or 16 bar form. It has this flow and this melody to it, no pun intended. So that means no matter what instrument you play, you have to have that as your driving factor. And almost even if you're a drummer, or you're a bass player, or a piano player, if you're a rhythm section instrument or a melodic instrument, that melody has to be in your head at all times. Now let's take it on a different standpoint. Let's say it's a harmony-driven tune. A harmony-driven tune usually means you have to take into account voice leading and how to connect one chord to another, which is, it sounds simple on the tin, but when you start getting really complex harmony, if you just try play general melodies that maybe work by ear, they can fit or they cannot fit. And you might have to take a more studied approach to get that. Giant Steps is one of those tunes where it's very harmony driven. And as such, that is one of those tunes where you cannot really fake your way through it. You've got to really get inside the music. If it's rhythmically driven, then you might expect a certain thing. Now it depends on how the conception of rhythm and how someone visualizes that. Maybe someone has a very open sense of rhythm. It's not locked to a quarter note. So that has its own interpretation. Or maybe you're in a different scenario where there is a very precise concept of rhythm. And that means you have to be on it when you're playing, and your approach has to reflect that. If the music is very rhythmically driving, then you cannot be floaty all the time. you can maybe float for a little bit, but you do have to come back and keep the time as your source. So I share this information because I think this helps a lot of musicians kind of figure out a direction for where they want to go. And as a band leader, for example, this is kind of the advice for band leaders, I try to be as clear as possible in communicating this with musicians. And again, this harkens back to the first point of be mindful of what kind of tune you're conveying to people. If the tune is kind of like a standardy tune that doesn't have such a complex form, there aren't really any big set pieces or not many big dynamic changes, and it's kind of just a tune that you play and the interaction is what makes that tune special. Don't try over direct or over critique or be very extra controlling of your band, because that's not going to lend itself to that piece, right? If the piece is more along those lines where it is a little more refined and there are these little moments that need to be taken into account of, where, for example, odd measure phrases may be the beauty of the tune, or maybe particular chord changes that are quite complex are part of that beauty in that tune, and it's what makes the tune special, or extreme dynamic changes. Then you as the responsibility as a band leader and a composer, as a band leader and a composer, you have the responsibility to communicate that to your band. And to the musicians who are more, let's say, interpreters, you have the responsibility to take that advice on. And the same thing goes, evaluate your situation. If you're playing a standard tune, don't try, or let's say something, I don't want to kind of pigeonhole it as a standard, but let's say you're playing something a little more open. Don't try to be very minute about every detail, because that is not the aesthetic of that vision of music. On the same token, or rather on the flip side of the coin, don't be too loose about certain types of music. Yes, maybe a tune might have all these little details and these little things that make it special, but that air might still be required to give it a looseness, give it a breathing quality, but do not ignore those details, because that can also be the difference between you getting called for a gig and you losing a gig. And it's something, with the people I work with, it's something I'm very careful about. And thankfully, I'm very fortunate to work with some incredible musicians who take direction extremely well, but also give me their ideas on the interpretation. And kind of my responsibility as a band leader is to kind of look at that, at least my style of band leading, is to look at that and go, okay, do I like this idea? Or does it sound interesting enough to try? I'm not going to shoot them down immediately. Say, okay, let's try that. Let's see how it works. And if it works, I give a very objective, and I try to be as unbiased as I can. I just try to say, okay, this worked really great. Thanks for that. Let's keep that as a part of the arrangement. Whereas if I didn't like something particular, I try to make a very specific comment. Okay, I like the idea, but I think it could be a little more intense. Or less intense, or maybe it could be more precise, less precise. I try to give a very constructive value judgment. Or if I don't like it, I say, thanks for the idea, I think it's a wonderful thing and creative, but it might not work for this context. Let's keep it in the back pocket and see if it works for another tune, but not for this one. So then, you have to understand the moving parts and be able to put this all together. Now, why did I want to talk about interpretation? I think it's, as I said earlier, I think it's something that can get lost. And this even applies to any style of music, a pop gig, Being aware of all of these little moving parts can be the difference between you getting hired and not getting hired. Gotta love the neighbors. So, basically, it's kind of like, if I'm, for example, on a pop gig, and I know that this music is very melody-driven, I'm going to be paying attention to the melody for the cues. Maybe that is my cue to get to the next section, especially if this is common. I've been in situations where maybe the verse is just one long vamp, and it's a very long vamp. It's one chord, maybe two chords. So I need to be paying attention to the melody and sometimes even the lyric to give me my cue to go to the next section. However, if there is a specific harmonic element, maybe that's my cue to go to the pre-chorus or go to the chorus. The interpretation is something that I think a lot of us take for granted as musicians because we get caught up in the data. I might have referenced this in, I think it was my Bach video. I think it was based on a Branford quote that I'd read, and I think it was quite valid in that jazz musicians think a lot about data, but we don't think about sound and how to play, maybe why we make certain creative choices, why we make certain decisions in the moment. It's a very noisy day here in Colombia. Anyway, why we make certain decisions in the moment, why do we choose this? And I want to encourage this in anyone who's listening to this video. In your next performance, digital, a recording, or just your practice session, carve out some time and play through a tune. If it's mostly improvised, ask yourself a few questions. Or maybe make a small recording of it and just listen back and go, okay, why did I play this? Why did I take this decision to interpret the feel this way? Why did I do this? Start asking yourself those questions and think a little bit like a producer, almost like a 3D perspective, if you would. Think along the lines of somebody sitting, I think I've made a reference to this in another video as well. Imagine somebody or you or a different person sitting across from you playing and listening to what you're playing, listening to the performance. Ask yourself, why am I playing this? And if the answer is because I like it or because I think it sounds good, I want to encourage you to get a little deeper. Ask yourself why. What is the effect of this? Is this supporting the music in some way? Is this helping to add an effect? Is this creating a sense of urgency? Is it creating more space? Is it creating a little more air in the sound? The reason I say this is so that you kind of build up your little library of effects, so to speak. Sonic effects, sonic soundscapes. Impressions, if you would. And it's kind of having like a painter having a color palette. The painter can see this color palette and has a choice of colors that they can, or a choice of combinations that they can make at any given moment and add that to the painting. By asking yourself these questions, you build that up, and then you ask, okay, maybe this music needs a little more air. I'm going to lay out a little bit. You suddenly catalog your musical choices, and when you're presented with an opportunity, you have a vocabulary of sounds that you can use in the moment. So, I hope this video was informative, interesting for some people. It's a bit out of left field for some of the stuff I do on this channel, but I really want it to be very holistic in the sense that we don't just talk about harmony, we don't just talk about a theoretical application or a singular technique or concept. I want the people who learn from this channel, learn also from the music I post here, to kind of take something away and be able to make themselves a better musician for it. And I think this is probably one of the most overlooked steps, ironically, in the entire act of playing music. We have to create something, and ultimately, no matter what position we're in, whether we're playing in a cover band, whether we're writing our own music or performing someone else's original music or playing standards at a restaurant or something, you're still making choices in your interpretation, and those are incredibly important. So, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, guys.